welcome. Welcome to your NAL program annual performance reporting webinar. Today is April 7th, 2022. We'll go ahead and play our standard disclaimer.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
All right, there we go. So thank you again for joining us today. Feel free to say hello to your fellow grantees and colleagues in the chat box. My name is Tracy George. I'm a member of your technical assistance team, and I'll be the facilitator today. Of course, you know your program officer, Ms. Donna Sabas-Burns, who had planned to be here with us today, but had something come up and was unable to join us for this session. But we do have our NAL and reporting gurus on the call here with us today, my colleagues, Sarah Brightwell and Alani Lilly. So we'll do our very best to answer any questions that come up. And if anything that we need to run by OIE or your program officer, we'll be sure to follow up with that. So glad to have you all here today. Just a couple housekeeping tips. I think this has become pretty standard for all of us now, but just for the sake of reminding us, if you're not talking, you can please keep your lines on mute so that we'll keep the audio clear so everyone can hear, and we get a good recording that you'll all be able to revisit later if you so desire. You can revisit this recording on the YouTube page. Feel free to drop your questions into the chat box as we go along. I will pause periodically to open up the lines where you can come off of mute and share your questions when you have those as well. So we will go over all aspects of your annual performance reporting today. We're going to cover all the forms and get into some details about what you put into each section, including your cover sheet, executive summary, parts A, B, and C. We also have some good standard tools as well as some new tools to support your reporting this year. And so we'll be sharing those throughout our session today as well. We'll also be sharing a few examples to lift up some good practices when it comes to reporting. So just a heads up, you might see something familiar in some later slides. All right. So first, a quick look at your timeline and due dates for your annual performance report. G5 is open for you to access that reporting package. You can get those forms. We will also be posting the forms in the chat box as we taught today, so you can download those today as well and have those on file to begin working with. Today is April 7th. We're of course here today at our APR webinar, and then your submission date. Your due date for the annual performance report for NAL is April 29th, 2022 at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we know those of you who have worked with G5, who've done your annual performance report, know that that is a strict deadline, that the G5 system is programmed to shut down precisely at 4:30. So we won't be able to enter information after that time. In fact, you may even want to back map by a couple of days, knowing that April 29th will probably be a really busy day in G5. Not only are you submitting your annual performance reports, but most all of OIE grantees are all working with the same deadline, as well as grantees from other parts of the Department of Education. So you want to avoid that cyber traffic jam, so that you don't get caught up in that gridlock if G5 gets a little finicky with all of the traffic on April 29th. Save yourself a little bit of a headache and try to do that a little bit earlier. All right. So we always like to start these sessions off with just a little reminder about why we do these annual performance reports and why we invest time with your technical assistance team to do these webinars and provide you with those supports. Remember that the annual performance report is a federal grant requirement. This is the primary document that is submitted annually, which allows you to document your progress towards those project objectives. And what you submit and what you enter into these documents is used to determine substantial progress. That information is reviewed. People do read it. Information does get compiled, and that information is used to inform continuation awards. So really important to make sure that it's thorough, complete, and detailed. And we'll offer some tips along those lines throughout our session today. So as you know, G5 is the system where you actually go and submit your reports. Some of the information that you submit can be copied and pasted into the online platform. Other information will come in the form of documents that you will upload into G5. So right on the screen right now, you see the landing page for G5. And I see Alani has dropped the link to G5 in there too. If you don't already have that bookmarked, you can do that now. On this landing page, you can always go there and check to see if there's going to be any maintenance or times when G5 might not be available. Always good to know. And of course, they also offer a help desk. So if you have any troubles accessing or uploading or navigating in G5, you can get a hold of the folks at that help desk. Their hours are 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern time, again. Monday through Friday, of course, except for those federal holidays. And you've got a few different phone numbers where you can reach out to them and get somebody on the phone and talk to somebody, or you can email them as well. Okay. So the forms that you do your annual performance report on is called the ED524B Forms. And these probably look familiar if you've submitted an annual performance report or a final performance report for an OIE grant before. These are the same forms that are used for all of our discretionary grantees. The form includes instructions and those 5 very familiar by now sections: the cover sheet, the executive summary, sections A, B, and C. One thing you'll want to make sure, and I see Alani's posting those forms in the chat box right now. If you want to go ahead and grab those, you'll have the most up-to-date forms available to you right now. If you have something on file, it's always a good idea to check that expiration date in the upper right-hand corner, because they do expire from time to time. And of course, there's a link there. That's a link for the Department of Ed site where you can always get those up-to-date forms as well. So you can either grab them from the chat box or visit that link to get those forms. Now I'm going to go through each of these, and one of the new tools that we have for you to support your annual performance reporting this year is a new checklist tool. So in this checklist tool will be several of the tips that I'll share throughout today's session. But it's a nice little instrument that you can have nearby to sort of support your reporting, double check, make sure you've got all those important details. There's a few tips in there too about uploading things. We know that G5 really likes PDF forms rather than other kinds of forms. The checklist that we created for you is specific to the NAL grant. And I see it's up there in the chat box right now, so you can download that and follow along or take notes on it, or just save it in your file so you can pull it up later. It's really meant to help address some common questions or challenges I think that we see with annual performance reporting. I wouldn't call it an exhaustive line-by-line instruction sheet, but more a summary of tips and things to remember when you're reporting. So I hope you find that useful as we go along. Let's start now with our cover sheet. So on the screen is a screenshot of our cover sheet. You will need a new cover sheet for your annual performance report. Again, making sure you have that most up-to-date form. We want to begin with item number 1. This is really important, especially because I know several of you operate more than one OIE discretionary grant. You'll want to make sure that you have your unique PR number, the correct one for this specific grant. Include the full number for the grant. I know it's a little bit long, but you can put that whole number there. And make sure you get that information in there. Item number 7, this is the reporting period for your grant. Your reporting period, remember, keeping in mind that's different than the full grant project year. The reporting period is October 1 of last year to March 31 of this year. So when you submit this annual performance report, you're going to be providing information, that information from that October 1 through the end of March of this year. All right. Item number 8. This item is about budget periods contained in the APR. And that is the same, October 1 to March 31. There's 3 lines, excuse me, there's 3 lines in section 8. Items 8A and 8C, as in cat, will both be left blank. We're not using those at this time. The line that you do fill in is 8B, as in boy, and this is for the single current budget periods and correspond with that reporting period that we've named on the screen right there. Okay. Continuing on with our cover sheet now, let's look at item number 9. This one is about indirect cost, and we'll want to make sure that we're entering the most up-to-date information for our indirect costs. These do expire from time to time, so you'll want to make sure, maybe even double check that your indirect cost rate is current. So you want to fill out items 9A through 9D as appropriate to your context, and also provide a copy of the valid indirect cost rate agreement. So you want to provide, in addition to filling out this item number 9, you want to be sure to give us a copy of that valid indirect cost rate agreement that covers this grant year, the grant year being from October 1 of 21 through September 30 of this year. Okay, another important item here, item number 10. This one, you're just going to make it a little check mark. This one asks about human subjects and institutional review board. This one is non-applicable for us, so everybody will click NA for item number 10. Item number 11, the last little item on this front of this page, is also very important. This one is about data privacy. Everyone should click yes for item number 11, and also include that corresponding policy that has to do with data protections and data privacy. Sometimes that information could be contained in an employee handbook or other similar document. You'll just want to get a scan or a copy of that and then upload that into G5, probably in your section C, and we'll talk more about section C in a bit. On the back of your cover sheet, there are a couple important details that we want to note. First being item number 12, which asks about your performance measure status. There's 2 questions. The first question in item 12 asks, are complete data on performance measures for the current budget period included in the project status chart? So you might click yes, and if you click yes, you're stating that you have all of the data needed to report fully on all of your project measures, and that's great. You might, though, need to click no. And if you're clicking no, you're stating that all of the data is not currently available and there's some reasons why that may be, but you will have the data in the not too distant future. So if you click no, you'll want to be sure to complete that second item B, 12B, and tell us when you expect that data to be available. We will be asking for updates to your annual performance reports a little later this year. And so you might have that data available within this project year, and you'll provide those updates at that time. But let's look at a few examples, because this sometimes it helps to unpack this one a little bit just to make sure we're all clear. I have a little bit of a pop quiz, so I hope you brought your thinking caps today. Don't worry, I'm not taking grades. So we have a couple of scenarios here, and we'd like you to answer the question, and you can just drop your answers into the chat box, or if you want to use the reaction buttons and give me a thumbs up or down for yes or no. We have a scenario, and the question is, should the grantee indicate yes or no for item 12 on the cover sheet? And our example is that there's a project measure that reads, by the end of the grant year, native language teachers will increase their proficiency in using language immersion pedagogy by at least one level in 3 of 7 categories as measured by an observation rubric. And then there's a little bullet point there with some context saying that for example, this fictional grantee, observations are conducted monthly throughout the school year. So given this example, should this grantee indicate yes or no on the cover sheet? See, Susan's got her answer in the chat box. Looking to see if anybody else. Will this grantee have all of their data to report by the submission deadline of April 29th? I see some other folks are agreeing with you, Susan. And in fact, all the answers that I'm seeing are correct. No, this grantee will not have all of the data available, and that's fine. So they would tell us that no, the data is not available, that will be available by the end of the grant year in September. Okay, here's another example. Same question. Would this grantee indicate yes or no for item 12 on the cover sheet? And in this case, we have a GEPRA measure example. The GEPRA measure that reads the number and percentage of participating students who attain proficiency in a native language as determined by the grantee through pre and post assessments of native language proficiency. And then there's a couple of bullet points there. The grantee uses age-appropriate native language assessments to measure proficiency, and that assessment is administered in August at the start of the year and May at the end of the year. I see Susan's already got her answer posted in the chat box there. Thank you, John, for chiming in, and Shella as well. Robert, I see your response as well. You are all correct. That data for that particular GEPRA measure is not available, would not be available in this example by the April 29th deadline. It would actually be available in May, which is fine. So they're going to click no and then indicate on the cover sheet when that information will be available. Awesome. Gold stars all around. Thank you for playing. We'll have another one of these little quizzes a little later on. So thanks for playing along. So looking back at the cover sheet now, the last item I want to make sure to draw your attention to is the signature that you need from your authorized representative. So with your cover sheet, you can enter all of this information. You can enter it into G5 and then download it. We also posted the cover sheet document in the chat box, so you can download it now if you want to, but you'll want to make sure that you have the signature of your authorized representative on there, and maybe even give them a heads up now about when to expect that. Sometimes we know these folks can be out of the office or, be really busy. So we'll just want to make sure that you're able to get that signature in well enough time so that you can upload the complete form into G5. Okay. Let's take a look now at the executive summary. So you will have about one to 2 pages to provide a narrative description of your program's accomplishments and highlights. You'll want to think about project goals, what those intended outcomes were for your project, and then provide some narrative description and describe the extent to which your program was able to accomplish those things. Or if not, provide some rationale about why not, including, maybe some ways you had to pivot or shift, or be flexible in order to reach those goals. Maybe consider sharing in your executive summary any lessons learned or insights that you gained and working towards implementation. Maybe you were able to overcome a challenge and accomplish those goals in a different way. But if your project goals and objectives were not met, provide in that executive summary information about the challenges that affected implementation. Some things that we commonly see are things like turnover from key staff, or maybe delays in hiring. Those are the kinds of things you'll want to lift up here in the executive summary. So do share how and if COVID has impacted your grant work. Don't simply repeat the narrative that you're going to enter into section A in your explanation of progress. Your executive summary should be different than the information that we're entering there. And then finally, in your executive summary, OIE really is interested in knowing what contributions your project may have made to research, or knowledge and practice or policies in the field. Maybe you've learned some things through implementation or program evaluation, or looking at trends in your data that you've been documented along the way. Those are things that can contribute to the field, and we'd love to hear about in your executive summary. So those of you who have done this before know this tip. If you're this tip is to develop this executive summary in a document or in a place outside of G5. G5 is programmed to automatically time out, even if you're moving your cursor around and clicking around. It's a safety measure, and you don't want to be stressed out if you did a bunch of work on an executive summary in G5 and it times out and you haven't saved your work. So take that stress away. Use that executive summary Word document that Alani just posted into the chat box. Work on it there, where you can revise and tweak as you need to in the coming weeks, and you'll save yourself a little bit of stress there. Okay, moving on now to section A. We're going to spend a little bit of time here and really unpack the details around section A. So on the screen right now, you see what section A might actually look like if you're working in G5. And section A really contains the bulk of information that you submit for your annual performance report. The purpose of this project status chart is really to demonstrate the progress that you're making towards those approved objectives from your grant application. And in this section, we provide both quantitative information in the form of ratios, as well as qualitative information in the form of that narrative explanation of progress. So a few components that I want to draw your attention to in section A. First, there's a space to enter in the text of your performance measure. And just a reminder, you'll probably hear me say this a few times throughout our session today. You use the exact wording and text of the GEPRA measures that was originally provided in that notice inviting applicants. And then for your performance measures too, you've entered this data before previously, and we're not changing the word of those performance measures. We're using the exact same wording so that we're reporting on the same measures year over year. We're not adding new ones, and we're not leaving anything out. You'll indicate the type of measure it is. I've mentioned the two types already. We have both GEPRA as well as project measures. The GEPRA measures are the ones that everybody reports on, that was defined by the Department of Ed, and then the project measures that are unique and specific to your grant program. You'll enter in ratios only. Notice I'm boxing out those target ratios and the performance ratios. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but no raw numbers, and those percentages are actually auto-calculated based on those ratios that you're going to enter, depending on if you're entering a project measure or a GEPRA measure. And then, of course, right below that, you see the space down here, and we'll look at some specific examples around project measures, but that narrative piece appears below that table where you enter in your narrative explanations of progress. Okay, so here's another look at how this might look for your GEPRA measures, and we'll get into those first and then talk about some examples of project measures. Remember, those GEPRA measures were defined by the Department of Ed, and that text goes right here. We're going to label them correctly as GEPRA measures. And then for the GEPRA measures, we're only entering actual performance ratios. So we're not entering anything in the raw number categories. We're not entering anything in the target ratios, only the actual performance ratios. And then, of course, the explanation of progress that we do for all of the tables too. So we're going to go ahead and unpack all of these. Here are your four GEPRA measures specific to NAL that everybody reports on. We're going to unpack these so that you know exactly how to calculate the ratios that you're going to enter, the actual ratios for your GEPRA measures. So the first two GEPRA measures are similar and fairly straightforward. GEPRA number 1 reads the number and percentage of participating students who attain proficiency in a native language as determined by each grantee through pre and post session assessments of native language proficiency. Now, the caveat here being that you, the grantee, get to define what proficiency means and how you're going to measure that. So for this ratio, your top number is the number of kiddos who reach proficiency, and the bottom number is the number of students that you served in total. Okay, so I said the first two are similar. GEPRA number 2 reads the number and percentage of participating students who make progress in learning a native language as determined by each grantee through pre and post session assessments of native language proficiency. So once again here, you, the grantee, have previously defined what progress in learning a native language means in your setting. So your top number is that number of students who made progress according to your definitions in learning that native language. And then once again, the bottom number is the total number of students served. All right, GEPRA number 3. This one reads the number and percentage of participating students who show an improvement in academic outcomes as measured by academic assessments or other indicators. So just like those first two GEPRA measures, you, the grantee, have defined what academic improvement is and how you're going to measure that. Some of you might be using, language arts performance tests or other relevant and available types of measures. So once again, that top number for this GEPRA measure will be the number of kids who make progress according to your definitions. And then the bottom number is once again, the total number of students served. The fourth GEPRA is a little bit different, and we have some examples of how this might look. So this one reads the difference between the average daily attendance of participating students and the average daily attendance of all students in the comparison group. And I know many of you have had a lot of discussion about this measure early on in this grant project. You had to identify a comparison group against which you were going to compare that average daily attendance of your program participants. So some of you your comparison might be Native students who are not enrolled in language classes compared with those who are. Some of you might be looking at comparing all students in a grade with those students who are enrolled in the program. But the key there was to pick a comparison group that you would have access to data. So for this ratio, the top number is the difference. So we have to do a little bit of calculation for this one. The difference between the average daily attendance of the participating group and the average daily attendance for the comparison group. The bottom number in this ratio will be 100, and that's for everybody. So for GEPRA number 4, your bottom number in your actual ratio will be 100. But let's take a look at a couple of examples of how this might be calculated. So in this first example, we have a participant group with 98% average daily attendance. They are there almost every day. We have a comparison group with 96% average daily attendance. The difference is 2, and so therefore the reporting ratio is 2 over 100, always over 100. This is the positive number, the positive percentage difference is 2. But what if we have an example like this, where our participant group is at 89% average daily attendance, and our comparison group's at 93 average daily attendance. So our comparison group actually had a higher percentage average daily attendance. In this case, the difference is a -4. So our reporting ratio would actually be 0 over 100, because we're reporting on the positive differences. So anytime you get a negative difference between those two, you're going to report 0 over 100. I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions about this so far. I don't see any in the chat. Okay. All right, well, feel free. We're going to keep going along, but if you do have any questions, you can drop those in the chat, or give us a little wave, come onto camera if you want to, and we'll be sure to respond to your question. But we'll keep going, and I want to show you how this might look in an actual Section A chart, so you can kind of see how that would look. So we see here now with our GEPRA measures that we've included that text. We've used the exact text exactly as it was defined by the Department of Ed. Got a great big no sign through that target ratio. Remember, we're not reporting any target ratios for GEPRA measures. We're only reporting those actual ratios. We see that it's labeled correctly. We see that actual performance ratio that's entered. In this case, in our fictional example here, we have our grantee that is reporting that they has 120 students total. That's the bottom number, and 46 of those have demonstrated proficiency. And then down in the explanation of progress, we can see that they've provided some information about how proficiency is measured, how that data is collected, and when that data is collected. Let's look at an example for GEPRA number 2 now. Again, we see that we have the exact wording, that it's labeled correctly. And in this example, in our target ratio, we see again that this fictional grantee example has 120 participants, and 92 of those students have met their definition of progress. And then once again, There we go. Then once again, we see down here that we have some narrative text that again helps the reader and the reviewer of this performance report understand what those numbers mean, how proficiency is measured, the tools that are used, the timing of the assessments, so that we know a little bit about how we came to calculate that 92 over 120. All right, moving on now to example of number 3 and how that could look in your performance in your section A charts. Again, exact wording labeled. This time, this grantee is reporting that they have had 55 out of 120 students show an improvement in academic outcomes. And then down in the explanation of progress here, we see that they have told us, how they define academic progress. In this particular example, this grantee is serving those early childhood kiddos. Others of you might be serving older learners, and so you might be using indicators such as a grade point average, or maybe those ELA grades or assessments that we mentioned earlier. But you'll want to make sure that you provide that information so that the reader again knows what those numbers mean and how they're calculated. Okay. And then finally, here's an example of your GEPRA number 4, which is about the difference in the average daily attendance between your participants and in a comparison group, reporting only in that actual ratio. In this case, they actually tell us how those numbers were calculated, once again, so that we know how we arrived at those numbers and how they're being measured. Now, I showed each of these examples in a separate project measure chart. You might have more than one measure label in a chart, and if you choose to do it that way, that's fine. You'll just want to be really clear down here in your narrative piece and label it so that your reader doesn't have to guess which parts of the narrative pertain to which measures are listed in that table. Okay. Before I move on to some examples of project measures, do we have any questions about the GEPRA measures that we just went over? I know you guys have all done this before. This is probably just some reminders for you. Okay, we will keep going along. All right. So next, I want to talk a little bit about your project measures. These are those measures that you defined in your proposal, and that you locked in the wording of those in the very first annual performance report that you did. Again, we're using the exact wording of those project measures that you entered previously. We're not changing those at all. We're making sure that they're labeled correctly. The difference in these measures are that you're reporting both the target ratio and an actual performance ratio. Again, not entering anything in the raw number categories. Those percentages will auto-calculate. So here's an example of a project measure and how it might look in this table. So we see an example here on the screen. This fictional grantee has a project measure that reads, apprentice native language teachers will increase their proficiency in using language immersion pedagogy and by at least one level in 3 of 7 categories as measured by an observation rubric during monthly observations during the school year. So a little bit wordy, but pretty thorough in terms of how it'll be measured, when it'll be measured, and what they're aiming for there. It's labeled PROJ, so all of those measures that are not GEPRA measures that are unique to your program are labeled as such. So in this case, they've created a target ratio is that 8 teachers will increase their proficiency in using that language immersion pedagogy by at least 1 level in 3 of 7 categories. And they're reporting that 7 of those 8 teachers have met that target. And then down in the explanation of progress, you see that information, that explains a little bit about how they're measuring that using that rubric, how often that data has been collected, and also how they're addressing the fact that they have a teacher who didn't meet that target. So they're giving a little explanation of progress around what they're doing to try to get to that 8 out of 8 teachers, how they're supporting that teacher down here in that narrative piece. All information in detail that we hope you will also provide in your explanation of progress. Okay, so just a quick reminder, and then I want to look at a few more examples here. So we remember back in the cover sheet, we talked about whether or not you would have all of the data available to report on your project and GEPRA measures. So your reporting period again is October 1 through March 31 of this year. And here we get a little bit more nuanced in what we're reporting around that data that might not be available. So in your project status charts, data that are unavailable for your annual performance report, but will be available within the project year, are denoted with a 999. So in that ratio, in that target ratio piece, you would report a 999 if the data is not available now, but it will be by the end of the grant year. If you have a measure for which data is not available or will not exist by the end of the grant year, which is September 30th of this year, you report a 0. So remember, 0 is only reported for that measure if it will not exist for this particular project year. So for example, a grantee could have a project measure related to attendance, or we all have a GEPRA measure related to attendance. It may be that, when we were in COVID and we're all virtual or hybrid, or maybe some of that is still happening in your community. Some schools didn't take attendance. And so we don't have attendance data. So in that case, the appropriate data to report is 0. But then you'll also want to be sure to say in that explanation of progress why that 0 is reported. Okay. All right, so just to make sure that we all got this right in our minds going forward, let's take a look at our scenarios again. And this time the question that I want you to answer, you can drop it in the chat box if you like. Should this grantee indicate 999 or 0 in their project status chart of section A? And this scenario may look familiar. We saw this earlier. The project measure in this example reads, by the end of the grant year, native language teachers will increase their proficiency in using language immersion pedagogy by at least 1 level in 3 of 7 categories as measured by an observation rubric. And then we see the additional context there in that bullet that this grantee is doing observations monthly throughout the school year. So we already said in the cover sheet, we recognize that this data won't be available, but now the question is, do we report a 999 or a 0? And it looks like we have some consensus around 999, and you are correct. That data is not available now, right? It's due, the APR is due at the end of April, but the school year will continue. So there's still some this measure reads that through the end of the grant year. So there would be some more observations and more data to collect, but it will be available within this grant year. So you were correct, 999. Okay, let's take a look at another example. This time, a GEPRA measure example. This one is about the number and percentage of participating students who attain proficiency in a native language. So a couple of bullet points of context here. This grantee uses an age-appropriate native language assessment to measure proficiency. The native language assessment is administered in August at the start of the school year and then May at the end of the school year. So are we reporting 0 or 999 for this project status chart? Seeing some more 999s. You got it. You are all experts in this. Good job. That data in this example will be available in May of this year. That is within the project year, even though it's past the due date for APRs, it will be available later in the project year. All right, one more example. In this scenario, we're looking again at a project measure. And this measure reads that by the end of the grant project, the language program will have a Lakota science curriculum defined for grades 3 through 5. What should the grantee report here? I see Robert's posted, he says 0. John agrees with you, so does Susan. Excellent. You are all correct. You are all correct. The tip being that the project measure says clearly by the end of the grant project, which extends beyond the project, excuse me, by the end of the project, which is beyond the end of the current grant year. So you would report 0 in your project status chart for this one, but then you would also want to be sure in that explanation of progress that you're telling the reader a little bit about the progress that is being made. So maybe there's been a curriculum committee convened. Maybe they've completed, grade 3 and they're starting on grade 4, but report the 0 and then share a little bit about steps that are being made to meet that project measure by the end of the project year. Okay, thank you again for participating in that. I hope that all made sense. Just a few reminders about that explanation of progress, and then I want to share some actual examples and look fors of some good explanations of progress. So in those project status charts, we're providing both qualitative and quantitative information to demonstrate how you've met or made progress for those objectives. You do want to tell us if they were not met, and then give that explanation of why. And then, maybe you have a timeline or a schedule of steps that you're taking to address those goals. Be sure to tell us in that explanation of progress, what data were collected, when they were collected, how they're analyzed, so that you can report the numbers in those ratios. You want to give us a brief description of any related activities or accomplishments in there. And if data are not available, provide some information about that and let us know when you expect to have that information. And again, all of the information in this section is really different than what you're putting into that executive summary. Okay, so I promised some examples and some look-fors for that explanation of progress. These annual performance reports, as I mentioned earlier, they do get reviewed. I know sometimes you click those submit buttons and you're not sure what happens to these things, but I can promise you people do look at them. Information does get compiled, and here's a few things that we want to share with you that'll make it really make your explanations of progress really robust, as well as really easy on the reader. So providing those details about that the reported ratios, that quantitative data, you want to address that. What do those numbers represent? It's, as I mentioned earlier in that explanation text, should be really clearly linked to each of those measures listed in the table above, especially if you have more than one measure listed in those tables. Don't make your reviewer guess which parts of that narrative goes to which measure. Sometimes that can be a little confusing if it's not labeled nicely. And then finally, and this is one that often gets overlooked, so we wanted to be sure to lift it up here. Tell in your explanation of progress how data is collected and compiled for reporting. So these are some look fors, and I see Alani's got those in the chat box so that you can refer back to those. And at this time, we wanted to just share a few examples. And some of you may recognize your reporting from past years. We wanted to share some good examples of explanations of progress. And for this, I thought maybe we could engage you with some annotation. So if you look up at the top of your screen and you see viewing Tracy's screen up there, right next to that, there should be a little drop down menu, and you should be able to click annotate. And that'll bring up a little toolbar for you to actually draw on the screen. You can underline, you can make a little stamp next to things. But I'm wondering if maybe we could take these look fors and you can underline anything that you see here that provides details about the reported data or explains how the data is collected and compiled. I'll give you a quiet moment to find those annotation tools and read. And if you're having trouble with the annotation tools, you can always pop your answer into the chat box or come off of mute and share a bit of text that you see that provides details about the data or explains how the data is collected. Very cool. I see folks are finding those annotation tools. Okay. There are other things that you would want to underline. Okay. All right, good. I'm seeing lots of you finding those details in the explanation of progress. We see here that this grantee wrote that the language assessment specialist has developed oral assessments for grades 4 through 8, that they're measuring growth in language fluency, grammar, vocabulary, and listening comprehension. The grantees provided some details about developing written passages to assess reading and writing. Down at the bottom, I'm seeing here that somebody's underlined that the part about assessments will be implemented in the fall and the beginning of the school year. So all of those are the kinds of details that we're hoping to see in your explanation of progress. Excellent. All right, I'm going to clear these. Thank you for playing along with that. I do have another example, and same question here. This one's a little bit longer, but this one is a project measure example. So once again, I'd like you to go ahead and use those annotation tools, underline those sections of text that provide details about this reported data or explains how the data is being collected and compiled for reporting. And then our other look for there too is related to clearly linking the narrative with measures. So anything that you see in here related to that. Okay, I see somebody's underlined that section where it says 40 students created videos. So that relates to how they're measuring the number of students who participate in Native storytelling initiatives, Navajo storytelling initiatives. All right, and someone down here has underlined attendance was tracked through the online platform where students logged in to participate and throughout the reporting period. So we have information about how data was collected and when. Okay, and right at the top there, yeah, we have some percentages that they provided us with. 80% of students participated, that they exceeded their goal of 75%. And they even, yes, down at the bottom there, they even talked about, how they're expecting to continue to improve that. All good stuff. Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and put a little annotation right here by the 1A because I thought this was a nice example of clearly linking. We don't get to see the whole example excerpt with the project status chart, but that little piece was just a really simple, easy way that they labeled this piece of the text to clearly link it with the measure in the table above. Super helpful. All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you again for participating in that. I hope that was helpful to see some examples of explanations of progress. I'm going to go ahead and clear all of our drawings now, and we will continue on with section B, unless anybody has comments or questions about that section A. All right. We just wanted to make sure we spent enough time with section A and all the nuances in that section and unpack some details for you. So now let's move on to section B. And I see Olani has posted the tool, or excuse me, the form in the chat box. So if you want to grab that now, you can. But section B is where you do your budget reporting. You provide in this section both a narrative as well as some numbers. So in this section, when you provide that narrative, you're going to be talking about that spending, what's been spent during that grant, during the entire grant period. Excuse me. And ideally, in this section, when you're writing your narrative, it's also organized by budget category. Again, that's something that'll make it really easy on your reviewer to connect that text with the numbers and categories that are reported in your budget form. So once again, a little tip from veterans and your technical assistance team, it's really helpful to craft this narrative outside of G5 so that you don't have to worry about losing your work or getting closed out of G5. You can write it in that document that Olani's got in the chat box now, and then upload that to G5 when it's all done. So here are some reminders about what you're reporting in the budget section. So in your forms for the budget, you are reporting on the funds that are expended or obligated, even if they're not yet reflected in G5. Okay, through the last day of that reporting period, March 31, 22. And this is why, we often recommend to our grantees for maintaining your own budget tracking of expenses. Sometimes we know it can take a while for your fiscal offices to draw down expenses from G5, and something might not have been drawn down, even though you've spent the money, it's been obligated. You want to speak to the G5 drawdown frequency. And if drawdowns aren't being done on a regular basis, we recommend at least once per quarter. If that's not happening, tell us what you're doing to try to remedy that situation, how you've tracked how you've tracked your expenditures, independent of your budget office. This is also a good time to remind folks about that G5 view only budget access. So for good reasons, the ability to draw down from G5 and access that information is restricted, right? We're talking about dollars, and so we need to be really mindful and protective of how that's managed. And so sometimes when you make requests to see that information or get access to that information, it might make folks a little bit nervous, but you can get view only access, which doesn't allow you to do any drawdowns or anything like that, but you can see for yourself without having to go through your fiscal office or some other way to see what has actually been drawn down from G5. And there's a process for making that happen. If you have any questions about that, your technical assistance team can definitely help you with the steps to get that kind of access. Also, you want to address in your narrative any challenges that you may have faced. If you anticipate having any unexpended funds by the end of the project year in September, and if you're using the optional budget reporting form, that's a really nice tool to help you sort of map out and see if you might be in that position. But if you anticipate that, and we hope that you'll find ways to use your money in appropriate ways, for this budget period. But if you do expect having unexpended funds, you'll want to talk about, how you plan to address that, and what you might use those for, and discuss how much funding you anticipate remaining and why. So maybe there was somebody wasn't hired till really late, or maybe things didn't exactly occur the way you had hoped, and so there's some remaining funds. If you do wish to carry over those unexpended funds, you'll want to indicate the portion of that you want to carry over, and describe how you plan to use those carryover funds in the next budget period to complete those activities. And this is really important too, because remember I said that at the beginning of this session that these annual performance reports are used to determine continuation awards. And so this kind of information about your budget is really, really important. If you plan to describe any changes you wish to make to your grants activities in the next budget period, making sure that's consistent with the scope and objectives of your approved grant project application, and any carryover request if applicable. All right, so Alani has posted the optional budget reporting form in the chat box. You can download that now. You see a screenshot of that on the screen right now. This is a tool that we encourage you to use. It's not required. You can use your own form, but please, if you do use your own form, be sure that all of the information that's here in this optional form is also in the form that you are using. This is just a quick look at the different fields that you fill in on the budget optional budget reporting tool. There are formulas embedded in some of those cells so that to make it very easy for your reporting. So you can put in your name, award number, project director at the top. You can put in, and if you're using your own form, you're going to make sure all this information is included, but we're reporting only by category. We're not doing, individual line items, but only at the category level. That approved budget, funds drawn down from G5, expenditures not yet drawn down from G5, things you know you've spent money on but haven't yet been taken out of G5, and that'll auto calculate how much available funds you have. There's a couple of narrative cells that are really important to also fill out, not just the numbers, but also the narrative piece, rationale for available funds. So a few lines, a few words here about, what's going on, why those funds are available. And then the next column is another number. What do you anticipate spending by the end of the grant year, the end of the project year? And then the next column will auto calculate. They'll say this is how much it looks like you're going to have remaining. And then this is where, in this final column over here, is where you put that little explanation as well, some text in here, just a few words about, the intended use of those remaining carryover funds. If you have any questions about that, your technical assistance team is definitely here to help with that tool. Any questions about the budget or anything that I've shared before we move on to section C? Okay, I think you're all still with me.
Still here.
All right, thank you, Alani. Yep, very good.
We're good.
All right, so not seeing any questions, so I'll go ahead and move on to section C. And in this section, historically and currently too, this is where you will provide any additional information. Things that didn't fit into section A, maybe in your explanation of progress, maybe you have a little bit more to say, it didn't fit in that section, or maybe your executive summary, you have more information that you want to share beyond the 2 pages. You can include that here in your section C. We have some examples that I'll share if we have time here in a few minutes, where we often encourage folks to share other great information, work samples, student work samples, photos, news clippings, or accolades from other agencies and organizations. All of that extra stuff goes into section C. So there are some things that we have always talked about including in section C. You see those on the screen now, sharing those success stories that didn't maybe get lifted up elsewhere, sharing any challenges, changes in partnerships, key personnel changes, any planned changes to project activities, specifically those that might be as a result of COVID, in the grants activities for the next budget period. Also including any information about unanticipated outcomes or benefits of your project. Those are things that we've always said, and they still belong here, and we hope that you'll share those in section C. We also have a new tool to support your reporting in section C, and again, this is an optional tool, but we really hope and strongly encourage you to use this, because what we've learned over time is that there's some information that OIE really would like and would be really helpful, but it's just not specifically captured elsewhere in the 524B forms. So we strongly encourage you to use this new section C reporting tool, because it has some information in there that we really want to know, but it's not specifically captured elsewhere. So Alani has posted that into the chat box now, and I'm just going to go through this quickly so specifically the things that we really want to hear from you about. So like all of our forms, all of our tools, this one begins specifically with your grantee name, PR award number, project director. We just want to be really thorough and consistent in case for whatever reason these get separated, that we know who's reporting on this, so whose information is contained in this particular tool. So first off, we'll tick off any grade levels that are served by your grant program. We've included early childhood, all the grade levels up through adults in there. So you click off as appropriate. Then we want to know the total number of unique students served during the reporting period and that you anticipate serving during the grant year. And we've listed those dates there so you can know exactly the time periods that we're talking about. But the total number of unique students, as well as the total number of unique adults served. We would like to know the percentage of time that your project director devotes to this grant, as well as how many staff work full-time and how many staff work part-time on the project. So for example, with the project directors, right? So your project director might be a full-time position, but they might not be spending 100% of their time on this specific grant. So we want to know just what is the percentage of time spent on this specific grant? Maybe it's 25%, maybe it's 50%. And then if you have, staff that are full-time on the project, you can tell us how many, as well as how many staff are part-time on the project. And I see the question in the chat box there, what is a unique student or adult? So that would be the total number of students served or the total number of adults served. So we're just not counting people more than once. Does that make sense? Okay, and I see we have a couple of questions too about calculating those percentage time. If the time percentage has changed, I don't know if Sarah or Olani has advice about that. Do we average? Do we want to make sure that we're reporting on the reporting period? Did it change within the reporting period?
Yeah, you'll want to use the percentage that's current. So whatever your current amount that you are on this project, that's what you'll use here.
And then we have another question there. Are staff who work hourly but not a partial full-time equivalent considered part-time staff?
Yes, Rebecca. Yeah, so if you have someone who's like a teacher and they're working some additional hours for you, that's going to be considered part-time. Kind of think of it as if someone's 40-hour-a-week job is not on this project, then they're going to be considered part-time. So if they're spending part of their regular job or just some additional hours in addition to their regular job, they're all going to go under that part-time piece. Really good questions, though.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, yeah, keep the questions coming. I'll go ahead and go over the other items. Here we have, we want you to let us know the applicable times that you are providing those services. So are your language programs happening before school or maybe during the school day? Are they after school? Is it a summer program? Maybe it's more than one. Click all that it's appropriate there. The last item on my screen here says all applicable methods of services you provide. So are your language programs happening in person? Are they virtual or are they hybrid? So a hybrid would be if you are in fact doing both in person and virtual. So in person is like everything's face to face, virtual meaning it's all online, and then hybrid meaning we're doing a mix of both of those.
And Tracy, I see one other question before you hit the next one that I just wanted to throw in because it's still on the staffing. Yeah. There's a question about if a person is coded to 3 grants, but mainly works on this particular grant, do they report what they report on the funding? So if you have someone who's working across multiple projects, that's still going to be considered part-time, even if the majority of their time they spend on NAL, because they're split across multiple activities and multiple projects, they would still be considered part-time.
Question. Okay. All right. We want to know in what kinds of methods you're using for language instruction: full immersion, dual language, partial immersion, or if your program is an elective. We want you to please list all services provided that the grant is currently providing. What, if any, evidence-based or services or strategies that you're using in your program? So probably you are drawing from a research or literature base. So in this section, we're just asking you to name that strategy or service and then provide those research citations or references. We're asking you to list all partners and denote their current status, whether they're active or inactive at this time. OIE would like to know about any key changes to personnel, and if there are none, you can go ahead and state no changes. We would like a little information here about how you plan to sustain program activities beyond the federal funding period. Tell us about any planned changes to project activities for the remainder of the project year. That's through September. And then this next question specifically calls out any possible changes due to COVID-19 in the grants activities for the next budget period. And then finally, those two questions on the bottom, both of these are just looking for one statement. So you can think of it as like a headline, maybe, to briefly state your program's greatest success in the reporting period and your greatest challenge in the reporting period. Again, just one sentence for each of those. Okay, any questions about that before I move on? That is your new optional Section C reporting tool. We hope that you will use this and submit it with your forthcoming APRs. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I did want to share some examples of some past APRs. So prior to the tool being developed, I thought we might share some examples of how your fellow grantees have used their Section C to highlight some of their program activities, and shared some of the really great work that they are doing. So again, you might see some of your work featured here, but I just wanted to take a minute in the time that we have left to lift this up, because we still hope that you will use this Section C to share, some of the materials that you're creating. Here we see some actual photos. We love photos. Photos, though, do take up some file space, so you want to be mindful about how many photos you're including, and consider some of that. Let's see, we have some examples here, maybe some of your project activities in action. Again, this grantee is sharing some examples of some of the materials that they use and processes. Describe some of their activities, showing what that looks like. Always really great to see some program, descriptions or partnership activities. And then we have another one here. Again, screenshots maybe of different activities or samples of student work that you might be collecting, different activities and community engagement kinds of things. So definitely, we hope that you will still use Section and C in that way, in addition to using that new optional reporting tool for Section C. Okay.
And Tracy, you got another question in the chat box. I'm just going to kind of throw it out there because I think this is something that may come up for a number of the grantees. Is it okay to say that we weren't able to meet all project objectives because we didn't have enough time? So there may be project objectives, whether it be, one or all, that this particular year you either haven't met or haven't met yet. We want you to provide that honest answer. If you didn't meet it or didn't meet it yet, that is okay. Put that down. The important part, and this is what's really vital with that, is to give a good explanation of progress. Just putting down quantitative information that you didn't quite meet it doesn't really paint much of a picture of your program. That explanation of progress is what is your space to provide context for just those plain numbers. It's your opportunity to tell the story of your program and what's going on behind those numbers. So what was happening that caused you to not be able to meet that project objective? What's happening moving forward? How do you plan to, moving forward, work toward meeting that objective? So that's why it's super, super important to provide those robust explanations of progress in addition to that quantitative data. But yes, short answer, it is okay that not all project objectives are met. Just make sure and explain why and your plan moving forward.
Good question. And thank you, Sarah. Any other questions? Okay, so just a few reminders now in the home stretch of our time together. A final note about continuation awards. Again, that is one way that the information that you submit in these annual performance reports is used. OIE does make every effort to process all continuation awards by the start date of your budget period. But please note that grantees who are not submitting APRs on time, or if there's missing information, or if we haven't made substantial progress, there could be a delay in receiving those awards. So, OIE will update you about any carryover requests. And this is key. Remember, we can't assume that your carryover requests are automatically accepted or approved. There is a whole process and review for that to take place. Some important reminders. Okay, G5 is open. You're able to, you can grab the forms and the tools today from the chat box to support your reporting. You can get into the G5 system and start entering data. As you know, only the project director of record in G5 can actually submit the report. There's your reporting deadline. Once again, has to be, all the information has to be in there before April 29th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern, or it'll cut you off, because we won't be able to get in there after that reporting date. So do give yourself enough time to finalize and submit your APR. Don't leave it in draft form, because that isn't submitted. You want to finalize and submit that form in your reporting forms in G5. And just so we can drive it home one more time, there's your APR due date and the time stamp that we need to meet. All right, so there's a few weeks between now and that due date. So here are some other opportunities that you have to get technical assistance or get your questions answered. If you have any, if you get in there and you're thinking, oh, I don't remember, or this is giving me problems, or I'm not quite sure how to respond here. We do have a talking circle coming up. It's a good time to get some questions answered, as well as office hours, which is like the day before it's due. So hopefully any questions about reporting then are easy to address, so it doesn't cause, so you're not holding on to those questions, you know, that might prevent you from meeting your deadline. You can also book an individual one-on-one coaching appointment with your OIE technical assistance team. And I see Alani's got the link already in the chat box for us. So you have that. If you need some times, have some questions specific to your grant, you can go ahead and schedule some one-on-one time. We're going to go ahead and put up our end of session feedback poll. Because we've got about 2 minutes left, and I'm really hoping everybody will answer those 7 quick questions while I talk about some other upcoming events. We definitely
Tracy, you do have one more question in the box.
Oh, thank you. I seem to have.
Well, and it's up above all the documents. So how long should I wait before our budget carryover request is approved or not? And so this is another one. You may be talking about one of 2 things, and feel free to clarify in the chat box. If you're talking about your year 2 budget revision that you submitted back in likely November, that should have been reviewed and either approved or asked for additional information by now. So if you haven't heard back, you'll definitely want to reach to Donna Sabas-Burns, your program officer, about your budget, your year 2 budget revision. If you're talking about carryover that you're anticipating from this year 2 into next year, year 3, you're going to talk about that in your APR, in your section B, but actual carryover requests really aren't looked at until closer to the end of the year, because the hope and the goal of OIE is that you're going to make every good faith effort to expend your funds by the end of the grant year to eliminate or significantly reduce any carryover. And so while they ask for any thoughts you might have on that now and ask you to estimate that and talk about it now, the actual carryover request wouldn't be occurring until later in the grant year. So I hope that helps. If not, like I said, please clarify in the chat box and we'll get you a better answer.
Great. All right, I see some folks are responding to our poll. We've got just a couple of you that we hope will respond to that before leaving us and saying goodbye. In the meantime, just a few announcements. You've probably heard about the upcoming project directors meeting. That's the May 11th through 12th. All project directors are required to attend per the terms of the grant. We hope to see you at the virtual meeting. I know some of you have been tapped to actually share some of your project work, so we're really excited about that. The theme of this year being the 50th anniversary of OIE's creation. There is still time to submit submissions for the Indian Education Student Artist Competition. We have 3 main categories: art, writing, and video, as well as different age categories. You see there, differs slightly between different categories. So with the art project, we encourage early childhood through grade 12. And then in writing and video, there's categories for grades 4 through 12. There's there's a link and an email down there. This email is specific to the student art competition. If you have any questions about that, but we hope that you will share this information, share the link, and get some of your students to submit. We're very excited that the Office of Indian Education has reinvigorated the student art competition. It's been about a decade since the last competition. Yes, very exciting, Susan, and we'll get that link into the chat box for you. So there you go. This, of course, here's the contact information. If you want to get a hold of your program officer, you can always email Donna. If you need to get a hold of your technical assistance team, you can email us there at oie.sceiservices.com. If you're not following us on Twitter, please consider that. And then in any of those communications, when you're emailing us, it's always really super helpful to include that grantee name and PR number when emailing OIE. That's really helpful to help track those emails and responses and make sure you get a timely reply. Thank you for joining us today. And I see it's 2 minutes over. So if you're still with us, thank you for spending a couple extra minutes with us. Best of wishes on your APR reporting. We are here if you need us.